I'm Neil Patterson. Welcome to the Sky News Daily. For the first time, the US has called for an end to the fighting in Gaza. The call for an immediate and sustained ceasefire at the UN Security Council was voted down, but the change of tone from Washington is still significant. As Secretary of State, Antony Blinken landed in Tel Aviv for emergency talks with Benjamin Netanyahu. He urged him not to launch a ground assault into the border town of Rafah, whilst the threat of famine in northern Gaza is rising. Foreign journalists are still struggling to gain unrestricted access to the territory to report on exactly what is happening.
Most of the time it's very difficult to work out what's real and what's not real. I'm not a politician. I'm not an aid worker. I'm not an activist. I want to get on the ground, crunch on that rubble and find out what's going on.
And we'll have much more from Alex Crawford, Sky's specialist correspondent that you just heard there a little later. But first, let's turn to our Middle East correspondent, Ali Bunkel, who's been watching the Blinken visit for us from Jerusalem. Ali, good to see you. What has Antony Blinken been saying? What's the significance of this? Quite an important intervention.
Yes, three main topics on the table, which kind of have been the main topics of discussion every time he's visited here. This is his sixth visit. So the military side of the operation, specifically, of course, Israeli desire to go into the southern city of Rafah, the humanitarian situation and the general opinion amongst Western countries that more aid needs to be able to get into Gaza, and that's Israel's responsibility. And then the third topic of conversation is the ongoing ceasefire talks and the potential for a new hostage release deal. So those are kind of the three things that Antony Blinken has been talking to Benjamin Netanyahu and the war cabinet about. But every time he comes, I think America's position becomes more hardened. And this is certainly the most robust I've seen the Americans vis-a-vis what Israel is doing in Gaza.
Yeah, well, look, we know that the UN Security Council didn't go for the immediate and sustained ceasefire line, but that change, well, in the tone, I would suggest, coming from Washington is incredibly significant. I just wonder whether or not, given they have been banging on that drum for quite some time, despite the hardened language, whether or not we're actually going to see any shift in the Israeli position.
Well, the Israelis have been very clear. I think if you were in the US administration, you would probably privately feel the Israelis have been very defiant, because the American voice that is normally sort of heard and obeyed here in Israel when it comes to conflicts in Gaza, that has not been the case this time. But this time is very different to anything that's gone on beforehand. And Israel is very determined to finish the job. And that means eliminating Hamas and getting the hostages out. And it is Israel's position, and you know, let's be honest, there is a certain military logic in this, that you have to go into Rafah to complete the job. Now, the problem is that the Americans and others think that that is the wrong approach. And Antony Blinken literally spelled that out when he was about to leave Israel on the tarmac of Ben Gurion Airport. And so therefore, you've got a couple of scenarios. Do the two sides get together, and there'll be an Israeli delegation going to Washington next week, and they come to some sort of mutual midpoint where there might not be a full ground invasion, but there might be more of a sort of counter-terror operation where special forces go in and out with precise intelligence? Or do the Israelis take the path which Benjamin Netanyahu suggested, that we'll go it alone? We would like America's support, but if we don't get it, we'll go it alone. I think if the Israelis do that, it will be quite problematic in the long run, and America will probably find a way to express its displeasure. And although I would say we've tended to see throughout this war America pressuring Israel to do one thing and Israel seemingly ignoring it and just doing what it wants, actually, I think if you look, when America has put pressure on Israel, there's at the very least been a subtle change in what Israel has done.
So, Alistair, from the perspective of those that I'm sure you've been speaking to, working in the Israeli government, working in the Knesset, what is the Israeli view of why the Americans have hardened on a ceasefire? Is it the level of civilian casualties? Is it these reports that we are seeing of famine in the north of the Strip?
I think it's both of those things. According to reports from Washington, we hear it was the death of more than 100 people in the early hours of the morning last month around an aid convoy that really sort of turned the dial for President Biden. Now, the Israelis weren't responsible for all those people dying. I don't think that is being suggested, but the IDF did admit that some of its forces opened fire. And they had been growing impatient and frustrated, I think, with the way the Israelis were handling the war and, frankly, not listening to them. And I think they've decided to become more forceful in their pressure on Israel. And that means doing a lot of it in public.
And I suppose part of the problem for individuals like yourself is that we're not in there on the ground ourselves. Obviously, we have contacts working in Gaza that we are working closely with. But Israel does restrict access. You have, however, managed to go in with the Israelis on what we know as an embed. Just tell me a little bit about that and any of the problems that you found reporting under what must have been quite a restricted set of circumstances.
Yeah, so firstly, I would say we have a fantastic team in Gaza, Gazan civilians themselves, who work for us and have worked for us for many years, and they have just done the most incredible and brave work over the last 5 to 6 months. As for going in ourselves, we're not allowed in. I mean, that is the bottom line. The borders are controlled by Israel and Egypt, although Israel has a greater control now over what goes through the Egyptian border. And so, therefore, our only option is to go on these IDF military embeds. Some people dismiss them as being sort of effectively propaganda tools. I think they do serve a purpose because in absence of anything else, it allowed me to get into Gaza for a short period. We went into the centre of Han Yunis, which I think is pretty much sort of deeper than anywhere else has been before. And we travelled for an hour and a half through Gaza, through the outskirts of the city. And I was able to see for myself the absolute devastation. Not a building left untouched, barely a building left standing. And so that was valuable for me to see it for my own eyes. I then went down in Hamas tunnels, so that was also an instructive experience. And I also saw where the IDF said that they know that some of the hostages have been held in prison cells. So all of those things added up. It's not a wasted experience, but it is ultimately a trip into Gaza on the IDF's terms, on Israel's terms, to see what they want you to see in a time limit that is dictated by them. And that is no substitute for being able to get into a conflict zone, as many of us have done before, and to be able to go about our work freely. Until we can do, we have to rely on our colleagues in Gaza who, as I say, and I reiterate, do the most amazing job. But they need to be supported by us, by other international journalists going in there to sort of help them with an enormous workload at the moment and an enormously risky situation.
Ali, many thanks indeed. Stay where you are. When we come back, we will be speaking to Sky's special correspondent Alex Crawford about the problems of reporting on the Israel-Gaza conflict. There remains a de facto Israeli ban on foreign journalists getting inside Gaza itself, making it impossible to provide eyewitness reporting of the impending famine, or indeed anything happening in the territory. Now, that led Sky's special correspondent, Alex Crawford, to write a letter asking Israel for access, a letter that's now been co-signed by colleagues from a range of news organisations around the world. For now, at least, Israel is refusing. And pleased to say, Alex joins us on the podcast. Alex, it's great to see you, because generally, when you and I are talking, you are off in some far-flung field and I'm in the safety of the studio. So actually great to have you face-to-face for once. Look, let's start with the latest that is emerging out of Israel, Gaza, those reports of famine being imminent in northern Gaza, and indeed the fact that Benjamin Netanyahu is not just denying that Israel is stopping aid getting in, but is saying that the necessary amount of aid is getting in. I mean, you're going to have a view on that.
There are multiple visual evidence on our social media. You can't hide everything entirely anymore. And the statistics show it. And also the qualifications for an extreme categorization like famine are very, very high. By the time you reach that categorization, there's multiple evidence on the ground.
And I suppose this goes to the central point that we're discussing today, the lack of access to Gaza that people would suggest is necessary if you're to understand what is going on the ground. Why is the Israeli position that journalists should not be allowed in? What do they say?
Journalists across the world have been trying to get in. And the foreign Association of Journalists in Israel actually took a court case to the Israeli Supreme Court, and they argued that it was necessary for opening everyone's eyes to what's going on and having a full and free press that involved allowing movement of journalists. And the Israeli Defense Force and the Israeli government, the lawyers acting for them, argued that it was too dangerous, that they couldn't guarantee the safety of reporters. They were worried about the journalists compromising positions and compromising their troops on the ground, and also that they wouldn't be able to man the entrance points into Gaza, all of which you could argue is relevant in almost every single conflict or war that there has ever been. These are considerations that every military has. So as far as most of the journalists are concerned, those aren't relevant points.
And it is not as if you haven't been in Gaza yourself before. I mean, some time ago, but people have been allowed in. It's why there are media organisations which are operating out of there.
The entrance to Gaza has always been, in the last few decades, dependent on the Israelis. And traditionally, you went through the Erez crossing. I think you've probably been there yourself. Yeah. And what you did, it was like no other crossing I've ever been through. It was very heavily fortified when I was there. I was a foreign journalist. I have no idea how unbelievably uncomfortable a Palestinian might be. You go through a tunnel, you go through several X-ray machines, a voice appears from nowhere on a loudspeaker asking you to put your hands up. In my case, at that point, they asked me to take my top up. I don't know what the reason was, but it seemed to me to be an exercise in humiliation. And on another occasion, when I was with the UN Blue Helmets, there was shooting right at the crossing with blue helmets falling all over the place and people throwing themselves to the ground. So it is a very intimidating setup, and it's controlled entirely by the Israeli military.
Talk to me then about the necessity of being on the ground to report on a situation like the conflict in Gaza.
I think it's absolutely vital. I mean, I personally think it's the only way to cover any news story. You have to have journalist boots on the ground. You have to have eyes on what's happening so that you can either prove what's happening or disprove a lie. And for me, that is still the basic of all journalism.
Give me some examples other than obviously Gaza, places that you have been where you would not have got the news, you would not have got the story unless you were physically there on the ground.
Well, for instance, the persecution of the Rohingya, when there was a mass exodus of Rohingya into Bangladesh, it was virtually impossible to get into Myanmar. We took a boat across from Bangladesh, myself and my crew, in the middle of the night. Certainly the Myanmar government was saying there was nothing going on, there was no ethnic cleansing, there was no attempt to burn their houses. The only way was on escorted trips from the Myanmar military, and you couldn't even get visas to get into the country. We landed on the beach, we found thousands of people, many of them visibly skinny and starving.
So when it comes to Israel, Gaza, is it just as simple as the Israeli government does not want people to see images of the starving children, perhaps in the north of the Strip, of the devastation that there has been to the cities?
We are seeing them, but they're much more easy to disprove or say they've been manipulated, which is the constant refrain, if you can't say, hang on, I was there. You know, even from our Palestinian colleagues and journalists who are sending stuff out, a recent attack at the Al-Shifa hospital, and the amount of comments on the tweet about this is Pollywood, this is fake, the same woman is in all of them. It's very, very, very difficult to nail that lie unless you are there. The IDF has taken journalists because they wanted to show them tunnels. They wanted to show them ammunition that they had found. One must ask, why do they not want us to go in now? So let us in, and we will either be able to back up your claims that Hamas is hiding behind civilians, that you are making precision bombs, because at the moment, there's not a possibility of either proving or disproving that.
When you're embedded with, the authority and perhaps a branch of their military when you're doing a story, is there anything necessarily wrong with an embed?
I personally am not a fan of embeds. I've done many with many different armies, including British and American, as well as a whole range of others. I personally find them extremely controlling. They do give you a window into what's happening. There is a lot to be gained from them to a certain extent. You can gauge the morale of the army. You are their guests, so they control where you go, the route that you take, how long you stay there, and whether you have access to talking to people. And from the IDF, they do not let you talk to any Palestinian. So every journalist that has been on an IDF embed of recent times since the Hamas attack on October the 7th has not been able, whilst on the ground in Gaza, to talk to a single Palestinian.
Well, the Israelis presumably would say that they were there to guarantee your safety and that they couldn't guarantee safety if you were chatting to Palestinians who could potentially be members of Hamas.
That's absolutely right, and that's exactly what they do say, which means it's very, very limited and cannot be seen as a full, unvarnished and unfettered access to the ground. Now, you know, Neil, that every journalist who goes into these hostile environments has done a shed load of courses and developed skills over a number of years. Yeah. Sky, and as well as the BBC and CNN and all of them, make sure all the people that they send into these extremely hostile environments are trained to within an inch of their life. We know what we're getting into. And frankly, it's not for any military or any government to decide whether it's too dangerous for us or not. That is our decision to make.
Do you think that people realise or recognise maybe that you haven't been able to get in?
I don't think they do. Definitely not. I think there's a general perception, because journalists as a whole across the board are trying to tell the story in different ways without access on the ground ourselves, that there's a perception that we're in there. I mean, a number of commentators have said that perhaps we're too scared, it's too dangerous, we're not trying hard enough. Well, I know personally my team has been trying since October the 7th to get access. We have tried absolutely everything, and I know a number of foreign correspondents. And we can't all be failing. We can't all be doing the wrong things. I know for certain that we are being blocked. We're going through High Court procedures, Supreme Court procedures. This is a chance for the Israelis to prove that they really are the most moral army in the world, that there isn't war crimes going on. This is the chance. If there aren't war crimes going on, let us show that there aren't war crimes going on.
I suppose the problem is that war continues to rage. It doesn't look like it's stopping anytime soon. So the idea that there is going to be a gap for the necessary investigation, the necessary evidence gathering, the necessary statement taking that an organisation like the ICC would need, that's not happening anytime soon. So any allegation of war crime simply hangs in the air over the Israeli government, and they would say they didn't have the opportunity to refute it.
And actually right now, you can see on live streams from Gaza that there are potential war crimes going on. The taking of hostages is a war crime. Now, are we suggesting there are no hostages in Gaza? Because that is a war crime.
We talked a little bit about the way in which the Israeli government is trying to manage kind of critical journalism. Separate from that, how is the social media sphere being? You must be very conscious of the fact that everything you do is being viewed very, very, very closely by quite a lot of people.
Everyone's a little bit under the spotlight because it's bizarrely very polarising. That in itself, I think, is confused. There's lots of different reasons. We've obviously seen a very dramatic spike in anti-Semitism and Islamophobia in Britain. And the reasons for that seem to be generated by what's happening in Gaza and what happened on October the 7th, but have morphed into something else as well, with a lot of political layers on top of it. And actually, I try and put away all that noise.
You have people, literally calling you partisan on a daily basis.
That's actually the least they call me. I've been likened to ISIS. I'm just looking at how there seems to be an awful lot of people dying, an awful lot going on in an area that we can't get access to. I think social media is massively powerful. It can be a power for good, and it can also be a really destructive, negative weapon, because there are people using very sophisticated skills to manipulate and put out false information. And as journalists, that is the new challenge of trying to,
as well.
and most of the time it's very difficult to work out what's real and what's not real. I'm not a politician. I'm not an aid worker. I'm not an activist. I want to get on the ground, crunch on that rubble and find out what's going on. At the moment, those Palestinian journalists are our only window into what's happening, and they are being undermined and derided and killed and persecuted and being told that they're coerced by Hamas. Well, I want to get in there. I want to see whether they're going to try and coerce me. Am I going to feel under pressure to only do one side or the other? I've been in many areas, along with these very well-established other foreign journalists, where there is a lot of coercion. There is a lot of fear. Well, let's see what it's like on the ground in Gaza right now.
Well, fingers crossed you get that opportunity soon. Alex, it is always good to see you. Even better to talk to you. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks, Neil.
And that is your lot for today. We'll be back again soon.